Hello and welcome to our third hypothetical webinar, Economic Charging Revenue Streams for Government and Mobility Pricing in an Autonomous Vehicle Future. My name is Jerome Carslake and I am co-chair of the ADVI Policy and Risk Group. So there I am. I was just having a little problem getting it all working. I manage the National Road Safety Partnership Program as well, and I'm here to facilitate today's webinar. We have a really exciting session ahead of us today with 4 incredible panelists and, of course, you, the audience. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd first of all like to go through some housekeeping on how we're going to run this and make it as interactive as possible. We've created some guiding questions and a couple of scenarios as well for our panelists to explore, but we haven't really got an interactive audience, and we've already got one question that's come in, so I think it's going to be quite easy. We want to make it a bit of fun, challenge, push the limits, but first of all, let's give you a bit of some instructions on how we're going to work today. For those of you who don't know, that's the ADVI webinar vision to accelerate the safe and successful introduction of driverless vehicles onto Australian and New Zealand roads. So basically why we've got this webinar going, isn't it? So this is our expert panel. We have with us today Brian Haratzis. So Brian is a best-selling author, futurist and thought leader and executive chairman for Macroplan. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much.
We have Claire Gardner-Barnes, Deputy Secretary, Freight Strategy and Planning for Transport for New South Wales. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you.
We also have Hugh Petroni, Transport Fellow at the Grattan Institute. Welcome, Hugh.
G'day, thanks for having me.
And we have Jose Villegas. He's Chairman of the Environmental and Sustainability Board at EDP and past Secretary General for the OECD International Transport Forum. And he's way over in Portugal. Welcome, Jose.
Thank you. Nice to be with you guys.
So, just a bit of housekeeping. We're aiming for around 60 minutes, but if we really get some animated discussion, we might stretch it out for another 15. Just to forewarn you, and it will be recorded and available afterwards for everyone who wishes to watch it. Questions, as we mentioned, this is all about being interactive. If you have some questions, pop them into there. We'll go through them all, and the really good ones, make them nice, short, sharp, and we'll put them straight out to our panelists. So let's first of all set the scene. What we're looking at the moment is the year is 2032, and we've achieved widespread Level 4 autonomy, where connected autonomous vehicles operate in autonomous mode in defined locations, where the driver is still behind the wheel, ready to take back control as required. Taxi bots are operational on a limited basis with an autonomous high occupancy vehicles integrated with mass public transport, and drones are a functional part of the supply chain. The role and functions of our cities have changed dramatically. Mobility and connectivity is not constrained by straight boundaries, and best of all, Australia is truly global now. So, for this really to be effective and for us to have a really open discussion, the question is, what's mobility and how will it be resolved in the future? Has Australia, Europe, Asia led the way from a languishing position in 2018? And what we're going to put out there, first of all, is a bit of a poll as well, as to whether you think this is actually a feasible future as well, that we're sort of talking about. But really, to get ourselves into mode, and we've just launched our poll. I don't know if you got that. To get ourselves really into mode, this is our expert panel now in the future. What we're giving them is a bit of a persona so they can have a bit more fun and really throw it out there. So we have Brian Haratzis, CEO of National Diverse Mobility Authority, really to control the mobility benefit of all Australians. Claire Gardner-Barnes, Global Chair of Flying Starts. Hugh Petroni, The Economist. And we have Jose Villegas, Independent Expert for International Organisations, Companies and Think Tanks. So, our polls are coming in already. 38% of people believe this is a feasible future by 2040. 4% believe never, and 18% believe it by 2025. So we've got some really enthusiastic people there. Now let's delve into our discussion, shall we? Here we go. So, our first question, throw it to you guys. So what will we be trying to achieve with pricing, and what is its objectives? What are we pricing? Brian, you want to open this up?
Well, I think we should be pricing mobility, not congestion or roads and specific road pricing. And I say that because I think the key objective for mobility should be active transport, not motorised transport of any form whatsoever. And I think, therefore, to achieve that, it really has to be closer to mobility. And I also think in relation to that, that it should not be a taxation scheme. It actually should be a universal mobility income. And what I mean by that is that there is actually an annual allowance for households. And say, for example, in an Australian context, that might be a $5,000 allowance, and you can spend your allowance on whatever you like. And if that's tolls or if that's public transport, that's fine. And whatever you've got left at the end of the time, you're taxed at the marginal tax rate. So if you don't spend anything because you've ridden your bike to work for all last year, you get taxed at your marginal tax rate. And I would suggest to you, a lot of people will be doing that so that they can take that free trip to Bali that they really love.
So it's like a universal basic income.
That's absolutely right, Hugh. But what it does to us, it makes it much more equal. And so that, because my view is that in Australia, I don't think that a congestion charge on motor vehicles will ever be seen to be equitable. And by the way, I think it achieves the wrong objective.
Wow. Jose, what's your thoughts?
I'm a bit different from there. I think we have to be charging mobility based on the quality of movement it provides to people and based on the impact it has on public health and environment, and safety and things like that. So essentially, it's an instrument to nudge or to influence people's behavior so that the whole of movement in society is performed in a way that is as sustainable and as efficient as possible for everybody. And we must not forget, at least in European countries, the current fuel duties represent a very substantial part of the total tax income of the state, in average 7% of the total income of the state. It's the third highest tax. And I think it should not be a tax, it should be a charge, and it should be connected to the quality provided so that people perceive this as a price, something that is related to the quality of what I receive, but also to the not so good impacts that I'm causing, I don't know, public health, sustainability, or road safety, things like that.
So we basically don't agree from the start. So that'll be an interesting debate today, I think, because I think in Australian context is more about equal access to opportunity. And I would like to think that if we start from that point of view, Australians will see that as fair, and we have some chance of moving that on. But what do you think, Claire?
Yeah, so as the global chair of Flying Start, my business is very much focused on making sure we capitalise on efficiency and getting shared vehicles and people moving together wherever they can. So I think from a pricing perspective, the key for me will be making sure that the most expensive options for mobility are the most inefficient. So it's all about trying to incentivise people to get in those vehicles where you're going to maximise public transport, where you're going to maximise people using active transport, and the most efficient mechanisms that will allow our streetscape to be owned by the people and used by the people. So, you know, the whole point of Flying Start is making sure we use multimodal approaches. We get as much as possible the people back on our streets, and we have accessibility and affordability for everyone.
What's your thoughts from an economist's point of view?
Yeah, well, so obviously I do see congestion as a problem, but congestion perhaps broadly defined both across roads and kind of crowding on public transport systems, because I think ultimately the way I think about pricing is what you're trying to do is you're trying to ameliorate the downsides of cities that have grown really fast, like our cities have and like our cities will continue. And obviously one of the big downsides is crowding when a city grows fast. And so one of the objectives, as I would see it, is to make sure that there is a price mechanism in there that allows us to continue to grow and continue to function as cities. You know, obviously Melbourne is now approaching 5 million. Will continue to grow. Sydney more than that, and will continue to grow. But at some point, you still want them to function as integrated communities, integrated labour markets, and so to allow that to continue to happen, perhaps you need a pricing mechanism in there.
Perhaps as chairman of the National Diverse Mobility Authority, I could let you know that actually what I've been asked to do is to maximise mobility. So my role is actually to allow people to move in as many ways as are possible, to reduce the costs of mobility, to make sure that accessibility is more equal in Australia. And my last objective is more efficient infrastructure. So it's quite different. So what I've been asked to do is quite different to the economic point of view. So I'm interested. What do you think about that, Hugh?
I reckon we're closer than you think, because I reckon it depends how you think about mobility. Because I think if you had a way to price access to roads more efficiently, so if some people do choose not to travel at a certain time of day, but as long as you put money back in their pockets to travel another time of day, or to give them enough in their pockets so that if they wanted to, they could continue to participate and travel at the peak hour because they're forced to. So I reckon possibly we're not that far away once we settle on a reasonable idea of what we mean by mobility.
Well, and there's a good question here from David. He's like, help. It should be to maximise accessibility, not mobility.
Yeah, I totally support that. I was going to intervene on that. Mobility is an instrument, cannot be the objective. The objective should be access to social functions, to opportunities, to social interaction. Mobility is an instrument, but if you have very adequate land use, you need less mobility for better access. And in the end, I think that what Claire is saying and what I'm saying are very similar to what our latest panelist was saying. I think his name was you. It's about making a system that is equitable, sustainable, and efficient. And for that, the price is one of the elements. It's not the only one, but it's one of the elements that allows us to induce people's behavior into active modes, into shared mobility solutions, because otherwise congestion is inevitable. We simply have too many people in the cities, too many people wanting to move, and too many people with money enough to have their own private car and drive solo if there is no signal against it. And so the price is an element to adjust behaviors.
So I guess drawing on that price question and access, so I've got a question here from John and Tim, both touching on something that's passionate from where I sit as well, being a country boy. So how will people in rural and regional areas not be left further behind? And Tim really wants to make the point. It seems to be centred around cities at the moment. But what about the rural and the urban perspectives? How are they going to get access? What's pricing like there? I'll go to Claire first.
Yeah, so I think there's some real opportunities here for regional people in Australia to benefit, particularly from the safety benefits that autonomous vehicles provide, and also the community joined-up approaches. So because we're now in a world where people are creating online communities, once we start to link that information to how they want to group up and how they want to travel, which is really not something we've done before, there are, I think, enormous opportunities for much better transport options in regional parts of New South Wales, where we can provide a service that we've never been able to provide in the past. We have never had before data around where regional people want to travel. And so this new world is opening up where, for the first time, they could get much better customised services that are much better responding to community needs and are run by the community and allow regional people who know each other much better than city people and so are more likely to trust each other and get into shared vehicles in a way that city people might struggle with.
Well, you know, I'm very much in support of that. I would only add that there's the side of community provided services, but also the big option of peer-to-peer services. This is emerging in many areas, in many rural areas in Europe, where people are interlinked through social media, and they start seeing that they could share vehicles and they could ride together. So this is coming up spontaneously. So you could have both community provided and peer-to-peer services. Because of the linkage provided by the digital connections, it becomes much, much more available, much more possible.
But I think
I agree.
I think you need to differentiate between access or mobility. I still think it's mobility, not accessibility, by the way, because it's the freedom to move is the issue. It's not. This is not a commodity question, but it's all about mobility inside an area, but then it's connectivity back to a capital city. Now, there's two very separate sets of issues, because one of the biggest issues in Australia is remoteness and just how far you are from a capital city and how far you are from opportunity. So I think there's actually two layers in this discussion. In that first layer, it is very common in Australia to have no public transport option of any sort in a regional and remote location, so forget it. So that's a really big thing, but the connectivity back to capital cities is also quite difficult. From a National Diverse Mobility Authority perspective, there needs to be very significant effort put into technology, whether it's 5G, into differential GPS and other technologies very early on to get buy-in. Otherwise, it will be completely city-centric, because even the peer-to-peer in very small communities is very hard to make work. We already know, for example, that volunteerism has dramatically declined, and so I don't know. I'm not so sure that I'd be so optimistic about peer-to-peer.
What's your thoughts? Oh, sorry.
My only contribution to this would be to say, certainly in terms of people living in rural areas, if you're thinking about a primary focus on pricing for crowding and congestion, then you're thinking about how much congestion you have in rural and remote areas, and obviously there's none. So you're looking at a world where probably, if you're adjusting what people pay, those people living in those areas are going to pay much less to use the roads. And yeah, so yeah, I think it's mostly upshot for the people in those areas, particularly as Claire said, that autonomous vehicles have the potential to revolutionise safety as well, and so you make that outcome a lot better for people in rural areas too.
And on top of that, the marginal price of moving by in a vehicle with electric power is much, much lower than with fossil fuels. With current prices, I've been looking at what the price of a litre of gasoline or diesel was in Australia, and at the electricity price. And if you compare that and you build it into the electric car, the cost per kilometre is about 25% with an electric car of what it would be with a gasoline car. So as I agree, the congestion element of the pricing would be virtually zero in rural areas, and the energy price would be much lower. So people will have much cheaper access, even if they go on their own car. But even on the peer-to-peer, there's a very interesting example that was born in France and is now expanded to a number of countries, precisely for long-distance connections, people wanting to go to Paris or whatever, something called BlaBlaCar. And it's been a huge, huge success precisely for people going from relatively remote areas into the big cities. And the guy who is traveling and taking his car just posts it up on their app, their website, and people who are interested to joining him on the ride will go, and they will pay, they will share the costs of fuel. It cannot be a commercial pricing, but it's a kind of fuel costs sharing. And it's working beautifully. So it's possible. But as I said,
we call that digital hitchhiking.
I expect the total cost of the trip to be much lower than today. And, well, it's hitchhiking with an organized base. Hitchhiking is a real-time opportunity. This is a little more organized than that. And not just the people who are passing by you on the road because they agree to a meeting point and they agree to a dropping point. It's incredible success. The French railways have had a significant loss of market share because of this service, more than 5% of the total long-distance passengers.
Yeah, I think there's some real opportunities there. In regional New South Wales, the public transport systems are very much focused on getting people into Sydney, and in the consultation we've done recently, they don't just want that. They want to be able to get to their regional centres, and that's not how our transport system's been organised. So I think autonomous vehicles could provide an amazing opportunity for regional and remote families and workers to get into their local centre much more easily without taking their car out. And for me, that's a huge plus.
Great. Well, I just had someone asking if we could show the personas again, so I just bounced into them. And I think this is a good segue to move on to the next question, because I think we have a lot of questions coming from the audience, which are leading to some of the ones we have coming up. So let's just move this on. So I guess, what triggered the mobility pricing revolution? And I guess just a bit further from that, we have a question here from John. how do we get buy-in from politicians into this?
Well,
So
if I can start from a Flying Start perspective, I think one of the things that will drive this is not so much government. I think the business and commercial world will drive what happens here, the price of vehicles, and particularly where they can come into Australia and offer a price point that is affordable to companies, to businesses and to families. And I think that notion we talked about before around social media playing a really key role, I think is really important, because people have personas in the digital world that they can use to link up and use as a connection point for who they get in a vehicle with, whether that be through a school community network or through a business or employment network or a sporting club. All of those networks will help drive demand for these services using the digital platform and much better data around travel patterns. So I think for me, as the chair of Flying Start, coming into Australia, it's capitalising on those business opportunities where you can hit a price point and really target businesses and families with a new solution to their travel woes, no matter where they live.
Well, we've got a similar sort of view over in Portugal, Jose?
No, I think here in Portugal and in Europe in general, it's really the combination of two elements from the public side is fighting congestion and replacing the public revenue lost because of the reduction of the fuel duty. As I said before, this is a very important component of public budgets, and it will be going down as the percentage of cars using fossil fuels is coming down. So the governments will have to find another way. Fossil fuel taxation was created about 100 years ago as a way to fund the development of the roads, and with the big advantage that it has a very, very low transaction cost, because in the end only the oil importers and refiners pay the duties as they come out of the refinery of the ports. We have to find something, but the digital connectivity makes it a lot easier to charge as you go. And this will be the key point. People will want to have, the government will want to have the revenue and to reduce congestion and to incentivize, to induce behaviors that go more into higher sustainability and efficiency. And so the pricing with this digital capacity of tracking people and measuring congestion on real time will have the possibility of doing exactly that, which is providing a more equitable and efficient way of functioning for the mobility system. And so it has to be a complex price. It has to have those components of quality and sustainability and public health embedded into it. But this today is relatively easy to do.
And James here seems to agree as well. He says, is our starting point for pricing the base of the road costs? It's easy to calculate, easy to explain, and should be easily accepted by users. I think that easily accepted by users. One, Claire, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there is a role for government in making sure we've thought through some of the really big policy issues around moving away from fuel tax. But there's a lot of complexities around the political system, around how we manage that. And so I actually believe the commercial world will help force governments into that situation where they have to make some policy calls around pricing. And until there's a large volume of vehicles that are imported into countries across the world at a pay point where consumer demand will really shift the dynamic, then it's going to be a really hard policy question for governments to respond to. I think they know it's there, but it's not the way the system's been set up. There's a whole lot of issues around who's going to carry the risk factors, who's going to carry the burden of the cost in the longer term. the whole roads infrastructure to keep it up to the level that we really want to keep it for good, smooth traffic flow into the future is going to require significant funding, and the answers to those questions are not simple. So I think there's going to have to be a big disruptor to force governments to really crack that nut.
So I think that the triggers will be a bit more subtle myself. I think that first of all there'll be AV saturation. So I think the biggest thing, and we see it at the moment, the debate in New York, which is there's too Uber pool has caused a situation where there are just too many and left too many shared pool vehicles on road. First of all there'll be a congestion issue. There'll be a perceived inequity issue in Australia because the real business case for automated vehicles is for upper middle class people to buy automated vehicles and drive them on congested freeways. and then what that will do is, of course, draw even more people to be doing the same thing. And so what I see as part of that is that there will be a mixed fleet for a long period of time, probably well into the 2030s. There will be automated vehicles on road. There will be calls for lanes to be designated for automated vehicles. We know that will never happen in Australia. And this AV saturation issue will cause modal shift away from public transport, in my view, and I think bus systems which are already under pressure, neighbourhood bus systems in metropolitan areas, I think they will be under even more pressure for replacement. And the last thing I think that will happen is that roads will become more and more seen as real estate. So major fleets of cars and delivery vehicles will be used, and these vehicles are there for commercial purposes, and they need to pay. There needs to be new drop-down areas, there needs to be new charging areas, there needs to be major new sets of infrastructures to fund all this. And the question is, moving from an individual or a private car into that shared future demands a significant amount of infrastructure investment, and I don't think that investment can come anywhere other than from mobility itself. And I think the easy way into this for governments will be to ensure that the road pricing systems, the softwares, are put into every automated vehicle and every electric vehicle, and leave the ICE vehicles out for a period of time.
My take on catalysts is mostly around, well, it's obviously on the technology side and how fast things develop, but I do see a big part of it on the political side too, interestingly, because I think it's very much a budget story. So it's a little bit of what Jose has said about fuel excise, although I feel less like that's the burning platform because it's been re-indexed in recent years and it's not falling off a cliff. And admittedly, of course, at some point it will, but it's a question of how quickly electric vehicles get taken up, and then it will. But certainly the chart that you can see, sort of shows by the early 2030s is still pretty small take up of electric vehicles. So I feel like, and obviously, existing cars will get more efficient too, and that will drive down the revenue we get from that source. But I don't see a burning platform there. Where I do see the burning platform on the political side is just the huge scale of infrastructure commitments that we're making at the moment. So you look at Melbourne and Sydney, the amount of roads and rail and huge, big mega projects that were promised, and some of them are underway, and some of them are being, sort of coming on stream soon. But a lot of them are sort of very much yet to hit government cash balances. And when they do, I think that'll be a huge pressure point for governments. And I think there's very much the potential for it to coincide with other revenues coming off. So state governments at the moment are in pretty good budgetary health, and certainly a big part of that's been a housing boom and a lot of stamp duty revenue. But you can probably already see that coming back a little bit and could come back even further. And so I do feel like there is a scenario you could imagine in 5-10 years where governments are seeing big budget problems and so are looking for new ways to charge, to gain revenues. And a big part of that will be user charges, you would imagine, because that can be, in some cases, more politically palatable than hiking up existing tax base.
I think that's a good segue. Like in the next question here, so a question here from Dixon as well draws on this. So what will mobility and freight pricing of the future look like? Where does the revenue go? And Dixon takes it a little bit further. The drones as a form of mobility realistically is about commercial delivery. So therefore, what model of charging do you think they would operate under as well? Is it user payer based on the model?
Well, firstly, there needs to be significant new charging for online and online delivery. Australia, there's no taxation. So in other words, there's a free kick for anything that comes online. So, and last mile delivery is an enormous issue in Australia as things currently stand. We don't have any efficient and effective ways to go about it. There's no incentives for electric vehicles. In fact, the biggest incentive is to have the cheapest possible vehicle that you can when you're only getting $1.50 a parcel. So that's just not going to work. We need to think much more deeply about online and the future of very significant increases in freight movement, and particularly in relation to multimodal. And we haven't even begun to think about that at the moment. The engagement with the freight sector is at best modest and at worst fairly underrepresented. And as Hugh would well know, and Claire, you know, when it comes to intermodal outcomes in Australia, we virtually have no facilities whatsoever in Victoria. We've got a couple on the run. We've got one in Western Intermodal and we've got the Northern Intermodal. But Sydney, you've got Moorebank and you've got Yennora, you know. But actually, the infrastructure is so underdone. I think there'll have to be a massive change in attitude, not just pricing. This isn't just about pricing. This is about investment as well.
What do you think, Claire?
I completely agree with that. And I think even the word freight conjures up different images in people's minds. For some, it's bulk commodities getting onto ships. They don't think about the white vans that are now clogging up our streets, and that's a really important discussion that we need to have with the community if we're going to address this problem that is a really growing problem. I think it'll be really interesting to see the role that drones play in this space, whether they want to use the airspace above our transport networks as part of how they navigate deliveries into the future. I'm quite excited to see how that will roll out, because if it's a truly efficient way of doing the last mile deliveries into those really highly congested areas, then that could make a huge difference for traffic flows.
So, Jose, do you think this is something that Europe will lead the way on? Can Australia catch up?
Well, first thing, I think one of our panelists has said there's different sorts of freight. There's the big bulks, and then there's the parcel goods and things like that, just to make it simpler. And there is one element that has not been mentioned yet, which is if you think about driverless vehicles, one of the areas in which the impact will be greater will be driverless trucks, because the driver costs about 50% of the variable price of trucking, and the driver imposes limits on how many hours of driving per day. So if you suppress the driver, you basically divide the cost by 2 and you multiply the daily distance by 3. And this makes the market opportunity for road freight much, much larger than it is today. So a significant part of the non-bulk goods will come out of the train, where they're already serviced by train, and this is already not a large market share, and they will move into the road service because of this reduction of costs and increase of the daily range. In relation to the use of drones, this is a very, how should I call it, micro scale, almost parcel by parcel. And we have to remember that if you take it one by one, you also need on the receiving side somebody to collect it. And so I see it as possible for very highly specialized, highly valuable goods, or in very rural, isolated communities in which anyway the total volume of demand is small. But I don't see that as coming to make a significant dent in the allocation of market shares of the other modes, at least until we have much larger drones than are being mentioned today.
Disruption galore.
That concept of the drones in regions is, not really going to help out. But the mass distance location charging, if that's not introduced for heavy vehicles, potentially we could see a big shift on those long haul routes away from rail and onto road. And I don't think there's going to be anyone in our community who really wants to see that. So I think that mass distance charging is going to be really important for our heavy vehicles. given that's really where the lion's share of rail freight is across Australia at the moment, and we need to make sure there's a price value in keeping that on rail and growing rail.
So I agree with the rail issue, but if we can get road freight's 80% of the task at the moment, 80. So if we can get road freight prices down, that's actually a very, very good thing. And what I'd like to think about is how do we actually get rail prices down as well? My thinking is that we need to actually somehow overall reduce costs and increase mobility. I think there's an interesting elasticity. And in the past, we used to look at price elasticity, and we used to look at when petrol prices went up, how many fewer trips and how we were all travelling less. And I think those price elasticities work in both ways. So I'm wondering whether or not in the way we think about our pricing, it's more about ratios, but overall trying to reduce the cost of moving, including freight. I don't know what you think about that, Jose.
This is an area in which I've worked for many projects for the European Commission over the last 15 years or so. Today in Europe, if we don't count waterborne transport, the share of road on freight movements is also around 80% and 20% for rail. And in many, many countries in Europe, there is already road charging for trucks. This has already been brought in, and still road is winning because of the much higher quality of service and reliability about the delivery times. So, and I've done some studies in which shippers would even say, even if rail comes to zero price, I will not use it because I want the quality of service that is provided by the road. Now imagine that road comes to a cost of 50% of what it is today, and this will not increase the market share very much because it's already at 80%, maybe it goes to 90%. The biggest impact is because of the daily range multiplied by 3, this will imply a rather disruptive reorganization of the logistical map of the continent. There will be far fewer warehouses. In some sectors, it's even possible to imagine that there will be no warehousing, no fixed warehousing. There will be ports, there will be factories, and all the stock is in motion, in vehicles. So this will be a radical revolution by itself. And as I said before, in the majority of the EU countries, road charges for trucks are already in place. So that will not be a big difference from that side.
But if that's right, that just means taxing freight. All it does is increase the cost of the goods.
Well, the trucks are already being forced to pay road charges exactly to pay for the additional damage they cause on the structure of the road, and because of the higher pollution they generate. So it's supposed to be cost-related charge, not a tax with other purposes than the collection of the money. So this has been very thoroughly calculated in Switzerland, in Germany, in the Nordic countries, and then the others have come along with the same kind of reasoning. So it's not taxation as a means of collecting revenue, is putting some pricing. And for political difficulties, for the moment, this is only being applied to trucks, not to private cars. But it's along the same lines of, how should I call it, charging principles that we were arguing before for the lighter vehicles.
I think there's a good point here from James saying, by changing the price structure for road, doesn't this lead to more freight on rail, which makes more investment in rail networks to achieve reliability and time benefits worthwhile?
I think part of the problem in Australia is that we haven't got the intermodals to support it, and there's still a bit of congestion because of the shared passenger and rail network. Throughout the Greater Sydney area, there's no doubt that trucks are the most efficient way of getting goods in and around to factories, to shop fronts, out from port to distribution centres and then out again. But in regional parts of New South Wales, it is rail that will continue to dominate the access to the port. We've just got to make sure we can free up the network to make that happen and preserve the price of that rail freight as much as we can.
There's a great question here from Neil. Does insurance and the pricing of this risk change in the future? Does insurance pricing shift people into safer mobility? What's your thoughts, Hugh?
Where would I start? I mean, so obviously there's this fundamental belief that autonomous vehicles are going to be safer for people to travel in, but there will still be issues. I think the question is about where the liability sits, and I think at the moment, my understanding is a lot of the manufacturers, or certainly Volvo, has put their hand up to say, we are going to wear that liability for accidents. So how does that affect the question? I think people do wind up in safer vehicles. I think that seems quite obvious. And what does it do to pricing of insurance? Well, I think it probably comes down, although you're looking at probably a higher total price to buy the vehicles to begin with, because there will be a little bit of, or very much, manufacturers building that cost into the base price you'd expect.
But do you think you can price people into sharing?
I think sharing, but not safety. If you looked at the evidence in Australia today, you can buy a 5-star ANCAP rated car for more money, and people will actually actively not do that. And if you have a look at 1,200 road deaths a year, 35,000 hospitalisations, there doesn't seem to be an understanding that if you buy safer vehicles and you travel safely, that there's any end outcome to it. So I actually think there's a lot of work that needs to be done helping people to understand their risk profile. And one of the things I really worry about in Australia is the proposals, the new NTC proposals, National Transport Commission, in relation to automated driving systems, where there's no proposed new safety rating system. So interestingly, for an automated vehicle, how do I assess my risk anyway? How do I know whether that bit of software is safer than that bit of AI over there? So I think it's a really great question. It's one that it's not a consciousness question we've got at the moment, and mobility will be price driven totally. If Uber pool is cheaper or Lyft pool is cheaper, people will use it.
So what I'm going to do now is move on to the next question. We've got a bit of a scenario. Oops. So what we're saying here is we've had a few people reach out to us around the issue of what does it mean for public transport. So here we go. Some considered that cabs would be the death of mass public transport. In fact, it was the opposite. What we see is high occupancy vehicles on call linking with massive public transport. Transport is more frequent and reliable and at the heart of the systems-based pricing. Is this feasible? What role will the government and free market play in this situation?
Well, if you're in Melbourne, it's possible. Trams are a really good example of something that can work, but the issue is there's a ped shed, or pedestrians only walk, 300 or 400 metres, and after that they just simply won't walk. So, but in an on-demand for example, if there were automated trams which could be on demand, I would think that would be very, very highly used, and particularly if they connected with trains. I don't know what you think, Hugh.
Yeah, I'm more interested in the bus, actually, which is so flexible. But my concern, I'm no expert, but my concern is the way that we're already contracting for buses means that it's hard to get a private firm to start operating a bus route out of a train station. And I could well be wrong there. I'd be interested if anyone else has a different view, but I do see that as a big part of the answer.
Well, we have a chair of flying study. I think it's a perfect segue to hear how you've accomplished things, Claire.
Yeah, well, I think it's all about on demand, and we definitely want to promote flexibility and access to public transport, and that's bus stops, train stops, rail stops, ferry stops. It's very much about intermodal responses and getting people into a shared vehicle into those transport hubs. And if we do that well, if we allow the data to help them organise their life, and it's not just individuals, it's their whole family. So the calendar for the family, getting kids to all their sports and music and drama things after school and on the weekends. We've got to have systems that are flexible enough to get people out of their cars, taking their kids to school and taking them to sport, and providing a system that will get them onto public transport. And I think autonomous vans, small buses, those sorts of enhancements to our system could be provided in a flexible way, on demand, that really meet the needs of families and businesses.
Jerome?
Well, I think that's, and that's
we've done.
Go on.
We've done a number of studies at the International Transport Forum exactly on this question, and the answer was very clear. We need mass transit to provide the capacity with very frequent services and high capacity vehicles, and then we need demand responsive small vehicles. All of these are part of public transport. They can be used by any citizen. And so the smaller buses, which are demand responsive, they go point to point, and they also go from points to the mass transit stations. The weak part in the system seems to be the traditional buses, which do not provide neither the capacity nor the flexibility. In our system, in the simulations we've done, none of the bus lines would survive as best options than the small shared vehicles acting on demand plus the mass transit. So all the traditional bus services were replaced by these smaller vehicles because they provide direct connections. There would be no transfers for anybody except when linking to a mass transit on a relatively long trip into the city center or something like that. So all the other trips point to point were done without transfers, and this is a big, big gain for the users of public transport. And one of the major factors that takes people out of public transport into their cars is the need for transfer, because that always adds an element of loss of reliability.
There's a technical issue in Australia with that. It is this, and that is that at the moment, private vehicles account for around about 85–87% of movement in peak.
Sure.
You could not double to try to double the capacity of the mass transit systems in Australia would be an absolutely massive, be way more than what we're currently spending. Now, so one of the issues is, even if you could delete the bus systems, which are really inefficient, but even if you could, we would need to completely rebuild our mass transit systems. And it's because of that I'm so certain in Australia the outcome will be massive traffic congestion and new traffic infrastructures and automated vehicles.
Not necessarily, because the easiest part or the less difficult part will be to have people who are driving solo to go into a shared vehicle which provides a transfer-free connection. So the first element is for many people to go from their private car into something like an Uber pool or something like that, or a minibus that goes from the area where they live into downtown. And this is relatively easy because it's a similar service to the one they're getting today, and this is the major element for reduction of congestion. And this is another area in which the pricing element can go. So if you have the pricing also discriminating against single rider vehicle, then it helps a lot if you have a good service with shared small vehicles.
I agree with that, and that's why I think we need a national diverse mobility authority to set many different prices in many different locations with different data sets and start to experiment over time. Because the first step in a place like Australia, where the average ownership of motor vehicles is 2.2 cars per household, the best thing to do is really, can we actually get households to actually reduce car ownership by one vehicle?
Yeah.
And to me, as a first step, that's what I'll be looking at.
But that's where pricing can have an element, can have a role.
Right.
People understand it has to be the pricing, but also the quality of the alternative service that is provided. And demand responsive services with small vehicles can do a service which is as good as the car or very close to that.
And the question here from David, how will government agencies convince global car makers to allow in-vehicle charging meters to charge for distance travelled? So how will we get that consistency? Will it be in the vehicles? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think that we've got the answer already. We will have approved ADS in Australia, so automated driving systems. That's the concept, and to do that, it'll be like an ANCAP rating, and we can simply specify as part of our Australian design regulations that you must have a software which has got an interface capability with our own charging software, which we know a fair bit about on a state-by-state basis from our tolling experiences. So I think we could specify as part of an ADS for automated vehicles, and I think in the future we could do that for electric vehicles as well. So that's all new fleet, and as we know, the fleet only turns over at around 2% per annum, so it'll take a fair while. But it'll be like, I think, television. When we decided to go digital, we'll set a date. And I think the date will be like 2035. And it'll be, well, by 2035, all cars will have a charging capability in them.
But there's also add-on units that are very, very, I would say, easy. If you have the standards defined, this is not a problem. And when Switzerland introduced road charging for trucks, any place in Switzerland, any road, any nationality of truck, they had to purchase an onboard unit, and this was in 2001. And the cost was 800 Swiss francs, which at the time would be something like, not very much a difference from the Australian dollar. But this was 2001. Today, this would cost, at the highest, something like 250 or 300 Australian dollars. And so as add-on to an older vehicle, this is something that is very, very easy to make, and it has all the electronics on board. All you have to do is to connect it to the power socket in the vehicle. That's all. So it's no problem, and it was even tamper-free. If you tried to tamper the thing, it would automatically stop working and register the geographical coordinates and the time in which it was tampered with. So it was really, really something that worked extremely well.
The issue that the thing I worry about with this is that if the cost of the onboard unit does stay at sort of $250, $300, the cost to roll it out across an entire fleet becomes really expensive. So if you're thinking about $250 per onboard unit, and you're sort of talking maybe 4 million registered cars in a sort of Greater Melbourne area, you're talking about $1 billion if I've done my maths right. And it's kind of, at some point that becomes too expensive to justify rolling out.
There's ways to fund that. There's ways to fund that. When we introduced in Portugal some 25 or 30 years ago electronic tolling on our motorways, the onboard unit was not that high, but it would be something like the equivalent today of 100 euros. And what they did was they were offering that for 10 euros, and then they had just a little markup in the price per kilometer on the motorways to amortize the investment that the motorway operators themselves were doing on the onboard unit. So it's really, that's not a problem really, because if there is road pricing, the margin that you have, the markup you have to put on the price per kilometer is very low in relation to the cost of the onboard unit. You can even, I would not offer it, but you can easily sell it for $50 or something like that. So that anybody would have, you have to have it to be able to drive. So it's not an issue.
So I'll throw it out there now. I think it's a good segue on this one. So how is a social license achieved for mobility pricing? I got a question here from David saying, how can we get enough people to want to sell their cars in essentially selfish society as well? So how do we achieve that social license? Claire, I'll open up to you first.
Yeah, so I think the really important thing, if we're going to engage the community in this agenda, is they've got to actually see what's in it for me. And yep, it's going to be safer, but they've also got to see that it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be more efficient and it's going to be easier to run their life. We all have very complicated lives these days, and for busy families, we've got to be able to sell the story that this is going to make your life easier. You have got to turn it back to the customer. We've got to understand what the customer wants. That customer needs going to be quite different in different locations and for different demographics, and so the sorts of products that we're prepared to offer, or the commercial world offers out there, needs to respond to that. So we've got a lot of marketing to do. We've got a lot of research to do to understand how we can tailor the shared vehicle and build trust amongst our Australian population for people to get in a car with someone else and see the benefits of that and ensure that their kids can get in. And I think that's where some of those community notions come through, where it's a sporting club or a school or a social network or a profile that they can see online, and that they know their kids and their family members are going to be safe on that transport mode that's being shared across the community, and it's reliable and it's going to make their life much more simple.
Well, I think it's a little bit differently to that. I think, firstly, we need to get corporate Australia across the line. I think we are so far away from a social licence. I can't understand. Congestion pricing in Australia will be so inequitable. I can't see any political saliency in it whatsoever, and I wouldn't support it myself. I just think it's unfair. I can't understand it. Why am I interested in pricing a pensioner out of being able to travel when I can travel? I'm just not interested in that, and I don't think the average Australian is going to be interested either. That's my view. But I think corporate Australia, we could impose a small levy on corporate Australia for journey to work, and we could do it on the basis of productivity improvements for the network, because one of the things about AV and one of the things about improved mobility is it actually improves productivity and it improves GDP. There are strong economic arguments, and Jose, you'd be across them, being able to support, I think, getting peak hour to actually work. So firstly, I think social licence is all about corporate responsibility and about thinking about universal mobility allowances instead of congestion taxes. And I also think there's two things we haven't spoken about: privacy, in other words, who owns the platform, who owns the data, and the other one is cybersecurity. How does that all work? So the social licence has got a long way to go here, and a lot of deep thinking, I believe, for Australia to be a leader.
On this line, I'm very much aligned with you, Brian. But I don't call it congestion pricing. I call it mobility pricing. And one of the elements is, as I said before, the price has to be sensitive enough to give inducement of behaviors. For instance, you could have shared vehicles pay a lot less than solo rider vehicles. And we have an opportunity, a window of opportunity, in the sense that autonomous vehicles will be very expensive in the first years. So only the rich people will be able to buy them for themselves. All the others will be in fleets, which will, I would say, very naturally be promoting shared use. And so if we discriminate positively for the shared vehicles, or the vehicles which are in shared mode, even if at this moment they have only a single passenger on board, but they're always open to receive additional passengers, this will be a sufficiently strong element with the quality of the service that people would accept it. And then I'm totally in agreement with Brian. There's still a lot of discussion that has to be done about the question of data security and data privacy. Those are two key elements that are now being seriously studied both in Europe and in the United States, and I believe in Australia too. If not yet, they will come very quickly to the surface because they are critical to the acceptability of the whole endeavor.
So, Hugh, do you have an angle on how because I think the social license flows in, and Jose's comments then flow in nicely into how to have pricing influence accessibility. Is that possible?
As in the question about who might miss out?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm worried about it as well. The one thing I do think, though, is that if you can put enough money back into people's pockets, then you can give them the opportunity to retime or remode or change the basic way they travel. So, and that might be a rich person or a poor person, really. You don't know. And as long as people are not in net terms worse off, that you simply are putting a price on travel at peak times a day on the road network and then leaving it at that, I think that would be horribly inequitable.
We studied this at the International Transport Forum. How much would be the cost of the shared mobility scheme? There was no road pricing, just like there is no road pricing today, but with very detailed simulation. Because of the additional efficiency and the sharing, for instance, the shared taxi would cost something like 25% of what it costs today per passenger kilometer. The new sort of demand-responsive small-scale public transport would cost 30% of what it costs today per passenger kilometer again. So the efficiency and the sharing are so strong, have so strong gains, that overall everybody comes out much better, much lower cost than today. And there's sufficient margin to add to that the road pricing element that we were mentioning. So I don't think it is an issue. If you are worried about the question of equitable access, which I am very much, the additional efficiency and the pricing elements will make it a lot easier to have everybody with much better access to all over the territory.
And James, does that make the point?
You have to bring in the efficiency gains coming from the sharing.
And I think that's where James makes an interesting point. Why don't we treat equity issues separately to road user pricing issues, e.g. through social security systems? This makes the price signals more clear to all.
Completely agree. I think that nails it.
You can have beat-tested pricing, but probably in this case it's not even necessary, because that's another element in which you go into privacy, data privacy.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a really interesting demographic shift here that will help shape this question, and that's the ageing population as they move away from using driver licences as they get older, but really wanting to keep their independence. So I think we're going to have real demand for the elderly to get around. There's also huge benefits from people with a disability to use autonomous vehicles. And I think society will really want to make sure that the pricing allows for those benefits to be realised. Yeah, I have faith in the public wanting to see some pricing structures that will allow for real incentives for people to get into shared vehicles, and for those that don't have great accessibility now to benefit from the opportunities that cabs provide.
Excellent. All right, so let's move on to the next question. So, how does mobility pricing relate to walking, active transport and fitness, and more generally to influencing mobility behaviour? Is that possible?
Well, I got some very strong views on this. I think we should be now, before the AV revolution hits us, we should be investing big time in, particularly in Copenhagen bicycle lanes all over Australia. We should be working through safe walks, more walkable, passive surveillance, more lighting, because our distances are so long. We don't have the passive surveillance necessary to really get active transport working. So I think that the starting point is to equalise safety levels, which is really journey to work stuff, very, very early on in this whole debate. Otherwise, it'll be unequal all the way through, and it doesn't matter how you price it. People still won't ride on Mount Alexander Road or across the Anzac Bridge with a white line between them and a B double. So it's not pricing. This is about equalising the infrastructure to start with, I think.
Yeah, I think look, I haven't spent much time thinking about it, but I think that's right. It's kind of, how do we want our cities to look? And I kind of do agree in some ways that if you don't do something now, it'll kind of get swamped and you'll be forever playing catch up, which you kind of are. We're still trying to sort of re-engineer our roads to accommodate cyclists better. And but I do think, yeah, probably there is a bit of an impetus to do it now before the coming deluge.
What do you think, Claire?
Well, I fully support the notion of improving our active transport opportunities across our city designs, and Western Sydney provides an opportunity for us to do that from scratch. It's quite difficult in established cities where there's such congestion to give up road space for active transport. So it'll be really good if the cabs can provide an opportunity for a new public discussion about this and how active transport can play a much greater role in reducing congestion if we've got that road planning right across different major centres. So, look, I think if we can get the discussion happening and the community on side and some real evidence around what the potential is if we do this correctly, then we could make huge changes in Australia around active transport behaviours over the next couple of decades.
Do you think, Jose, if we were to incentivise people? Sorry, do you think, Jose, if we're actually able to incentivise people to be active transport? So if you actually walk and you run and you do things, you might get a credit to use.
You don't need to incentivise a lot, but you have to make them feel secure and comfortable. And this is essentially a question of allocation of physical space at the road level. The good thing is that if you do that, the easiest way to do it, I would say in most cases, the only feasible way to do it, is to reduce the space allocated to cars and in the first order to parked cars. So if you reduce parking supply on the curb, you can have a significant increase of road space for pedestrians and for two-wheel vehicles. And this is something that gives you a boost to the active mobility and a constraint on the use of the private car, and helps push people into the shared mobility, because the shared vehicles will have a lot less demand for parking. And so if you play this instrument right, it gives you the positive incentive to the active mobility, and it gives you the negative incentive to the use of the private car, and move people either to the active modes or to the shared mobility.
And I've got a great point here from Russell that he's raised. Are we going to charge even more for empty autonomous vehicles? As today, it's cheaper to keep an electric vehicle circulating than pay for parking at CBD locations.
That's part of what I said, the discrimination of pricing according to the impacts caused and to the use they're getting. If you have a car drive with a single person on board with closed doors, let's say a solo rider, or even worse, an empty car, it should be paying more per kilometer. You have to be smart enough to be charging less when this vehicle is providing mobility to a larger number of people. You charge more if it is one, you charge even more if it is zero. It's the only way, otherwise autonomous vehicles will be roaming all the time, and it will be chaotic. There are several studies by the University of California, Berkeley, Susan Shaheen, where she has studied this, and the consequences can be dramatic. So it's a very good point, good question, because this will be an absolute need of any pricing policy, is that roaming empty vehicles will have to be charged much more severely.
It's not clear also in Australia that AVs should be able to travel everywhere motor vehicles currently travel. And so I'd suggest to you there would be some locations where you might want to keep automated vehicles on the edge of CBDs. That would be a good example of that, not let them actually rotate. And so that you must use public transport or active.
It can be difficult to restrain that. If once they are technologically very fit, it could be difficult to do that, because if they are actually safer than human-driven vehicles, restricting their use on some areas might force an increase of the road safety issues, which is politically very hard to defend.
But we might also we might use that as a segue to actually eliminate both forms of vehicles. So we actually redesign the city so that we actually minimise these problems. I don't think there's any need to have the current city format as we're moving into the technological age. I think we can sit here today and really make some suggestions and ideas about how we would like things to work in the future, rather than assuming things work the way they work today.
Yeah.
So I guess we're just sort of coming towards the end now. So I've got one more question, then we'll sort of be winding up. How do we get a new pricing paradigm? So where does this leadership come from? We've had quite a few questions touching on that. What do you think, Claire?
Well, look, I think government's got to play a key role in leading the community in this space. Part of it is posing the policy questions that need to be resolved and engaging the public in those discussions and making it real for them now, so that they have a sense of urgency that they can shape the future over the next 5 to 10 years. If it's seen as something that's not going to happen for decades, then the community won't want to engage. So politicians, government do need to play a role, but part of that is making the problem real for people right now.
Look, I have been of the view of the last couple of years that we need to invent a new industry structure. This is not about replicating anything that we've currently got at the moment. And I'm attracted to things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which the Productivity Commission, in fact, invented as a world first way to look at disability. And my thinking has been that some good leadership would be to simply ask the Productivity Commission to look at some questions and let the community, let's define the questions widely, and let the Productivity Commission have a first run at designing an institutional structure or an institutional framework. And that's how I got to the concept of a National Diverse Mobility Authority, because to me, whether that's a simplistic view, But I think we do have a framework here to ask and answer that question, and I'd love to see federal and state governments gutsy enough to just ask the questions.
What do you think, Hugh?
Yes, I think that my view is that change generally gets forced on us rather than us going out sort of chasing it, and we see that very much so in the case of ride sharing. So where Uber arrives and sort of belligerently pushed its way into place and disrupted the taxi industry, and I feel like that will be the case again. So there will be two forces for me. So one is the extent how fast technology develops, and how much that pushes its way onto the scene, and so how much that changes road demand, and then also on the budget side as well. So how fast shrinking budget revenues and hugely growing expenditures forces governments to think about doing something differently.
Jose, you got anything to add at all?
Yeah, I essentially agree with all our colleagues. All of those will be sources of, let me call it, stimuli or provocations to the system. Leadership has to come from a political leader, but you don't define how they come. But it's really the role of all of us in the industry will be to create new questions, new tensions, new opportunities. Then someone has to bring it all up to a political proposal, and it has to make sense for the community. And this is something that you cannot define how it happens. We only hope that it will happen because the tensions will be big enough. And if the reaction is too late, there will be big distortions. And so hopefully by having sessions like this one and by having documents like the ones that Brian mentioned, the attention of the politicians will start being geared up to these questions, and hopefully one or two of them will come up with good suggestions that will be brought for political discussion and ultimately, hopefully, for political approval.
In hope, indeed. So, as we're now coming towards the end, so in closing, what I'd like to do is just go through and invite each of our panelists to go through what are the key things that Australia really needs to do to ensure pricing reform is ready for connected and automated vehicles. And I'll go across, first of all, to Brian. Over to you, Brian.
Well, to me, this is all about universality. First of all, it's equality of opportunity and a recognition that actually, when you're in a situation where you have global technologies colliding with people's lives and colliding with cities, the option is not to do nothing. There are real winners and there are real losers. So firstly, there is a big awareness raising issue. And the second part, I think, is to really focus on the have-nots right now. And that is, and Claire mentioned this is the elderly and the disabled that actually require help right now. And we can do that. We could actually invent and do things today which would solve those problems, and I think that would then get the ball rolling, and so that the community would say, well, there are in fact solutions that can be made to work, and so the EV revolution is real, because I actually think there's not a recognition yet that it's real.
Great. I'm just going to launch a poll as well, so people can throw their sort of two bobs worth into what triggers change. Claire, over to you.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with that. I think we've got to create the public narrative. We've got to get some leadership. We've got to demonstrate to the world that our markets are open to new opportunities, but it's a structured market where we really want to make sure we incentivise shared use of these vehicles, where we want to make sure that those who can benefit most from this new efficiency, this new technology, have those opportunities, and that we want to make sure that the price point allows for those people who, and those companies and business who can really drive change across Australia, can make that happen in a way that will bring huge efficiencies across the network, not just for passengers, but for freight.
Thank you, Claire. Hugh, what are your thoughts?
So I think clearly the future is very uncertain and unclear how everything will unfold. So the big thing for me is for governments to be in a position to be as flexible as possible, which means not locking themselves into certain things. And in particular, on my mind here are things like toll roads, where we do a deal for a toll road and we lock in prices today that will apply for the next 30 plus years. And I think there's huge risks for that because, you know, in 5 years, 10, 15 years time, the world will look very different. We may need to rebalance the way people travel on our networks, and all of a sudden we're unscrambling a maze of contracts. And I think about buses as well, because obviously, as we've talked about, the sort of very small point-to-point on-demand bus networks should be a big part of the future. And so want to create a space for new entrants and new people to come in and set up services that will be take advantage of the new technologies we're going to see.
Thank you, Hugh. Jose, you got a closing comment for us, please?
Yeah, thanks. I largely agree with my colleagues. I think we have an opportunity now to have much higher efficiency, but at the same time to provide very, I would say, very wise solutions to ensure equitable access to all the segments of the population. And the other element is what you just mentioned. We have to understand that there's a whole need for a very different style of regulation and contracting based on the data and avoiding long-term solutions, at least for the next 25 or 30 years. The rhythm of transition will be so strong that any long-term contract will be destroyed as it goes. And then the public side will have to compensate the concessionaires and things like that. So avoid these kind of long-term things. Or if you want to do it on first principles and not on technical solutions. But it's really a massive opportunity to have at the same time efficiency and economic sustainability and social sustainability by equity. So it's really an important thing to bring this notion that all of this becomes possible at the same time if we introduce this digital connectivity, the demand responsive services, and the equitable access concerns.
Fantastic, an exciting future ahead. And just to let everyone know, so we had 34% identified that declining fuel excise will probably be the biggest incentive, and the rest are all pretty even from that point. So now I'd like to thank you, our panelists, for your time today, and to our listeners in particular. I hope this has given you some insights and thoughts about economics and changing revenue streams for government mobility pricing in an autonomous vehicle future. Our next webinar is scheduled for September, and this will be looking at insurance, which a few people were asking about, and one other one looking over barriers. And just to let everyone know, the ADVI Summit is scheduled to take place towards the end of October, start of November, where there'll be a whole lot more exploration and details, and we're hopefully drawing together some of our thinking around this at the moment. So thank you very much for your time today. Have a lovely and safe evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.